Hello there. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. This video explores death not as a mystery to fear, but as a process to understand. Through science, biology, psychology, history, and culture, we will look at what death actually is, how it happens, how humans have explained it across time, and what modern research truly knows. The goal is clarity, not shock, understanding, not speculation. Everything will be explained carefully and step by step, so that complex ideas feel grounded and connected. By the end, death will not feel abstract or dramatic. It will feel understandable, human, and real. One curious soul at a time. Before we start, if you appreciate long-form, thoughtful videos like this, you can support the channel by liking the video, subscribing, and sharing your thoughts in the comments. It helps make deep, research-based content possible. When people talk about death, they usually imagine a single instant, a final breath, a silent heartbeat, a moment where everything stops. Science does not see death that way. In biology and medicine, death is understood as a process, not an event. It is the gradual and irreversible loss of the body's ability to function as a coordinated whole. Different systems fail at different times, and some continue briefly even after others have stopped. To understand death clearly, the first thing to understand is coordination. A living body is not alive because its parts exist. It is alive because its parts communicate. Oxygen moves from lungs to blood. Blood moves nutrients to cells. Electrical signals travel through nerves. Chemical signals regulate temperature, balance, repair, and awareness. Life depends on this constant integration. Death begins when that integration breaks down beyond repair. Modern medicine uses two main criteria to define death. The first is the irreversible stopping of circulation and breathing. The second is the irreversible loss of all brain function, including the brainstem. These definitions exist because technology has changed how long individual systems can be artificially supported. A heart can be kept beating by machines. Lungs can be forced to move air. But no machine can restore a brain that has permanently lost its ability to function as a whole. That is why the brain holds such a central role in defining death today. This distinction matters because the body does not stop all at once. When circulation stops, brain cells begin to fail within minutes. They require a constant supply of oxygen and glucose, and they store almost no energy. Without oxygen, their electrical balance collapses quickly. Consciousness fades not because the mind chooses to stop, but because the biological machinery that creates awareness can no longer sustain itself. Other cells behave differently. Muscle cells can survive longer without oxygen. Skin cells and bone cells can persist even longer. This uneven survival creates a situation where the organism is dead, but not every cell is immediately destroyed. This is one of the most misunderstood aspects of death. Death is not the moment when the last cell dies. It is the moment when the body can no longer function as a unified system. This is why organ transplantation is possible. Organs are taken from bodies that are legally dead, but whose cells have not yet broken down. The organism has ceased to exist as a coordinated whole, even though some tissues remain viable for a short time. Another critical element of death is irreversibility. Temporary loss of heartbeat does not mean death if circulation can be restored without permanent damage. Temporary loss of breathing does not mean death if oxygen flow returns in time. Even long periods of unconsciousness, coma, or anesthesia are not death because the underlying system still exists. Death is declared only when recovery is no longer biologically possible. This idea of permanence separates death from conditions that may look similar on the surface. Sleep, Fainting, coma, and even deep anesthesia all involve reduced awareness or responsiveness, but the internal coordination remains intact. Signals still move. Balance is still regulated. Repair still happens. In death, repair stops. Cells lose the ability to regulate themselves. Membranes fail. Chemical gradients collapse. Energy production ceases. Once these changes pass a certain threshold, the damage cannot be undone. Historically, humans struggled to identify this boundary. Before modern tools, death was declared based on stillness, cold skin, or absence of breath. These signs were unreliable. There are documented cases of people waking during funerals or being buried alive due to mistaken death declarations. Modern medicine reduced that uncertainty by focusing on function rather than appearance. Reflex testing, breathing response, brain electrical activity. Death is now defined by what the body can no longer do, not by how it looks. This shift revealed something important. Death is not a switch that flips off. It is a collapse of coordination that unfolds over time. Understanding death begins with removing the idea of a single dramatic moment and replacing it with a biological reality. A living body is a system held together by constant communication. Death is what happens when that communication permanently fails. This perspective does not remove the emotional weight of death, but it removes confusion. It allows us to examine what happens next with clarity, rather than assumption. When death begins, the body does not collapse all at once. It follows a sequence shaped by biology, energy, and dependency. The system most vulnerable to failure is circulation. The heart's role is simple but absolute. It keeps oxygen moving. Every cell depends on a continuous supply of oxygen to maintain order inside itself. When the heart can no longer pump effectively, oxygen delivery slows and then stops. This single failure begins a cascade. Within seconds of reduced circulation, the brain reacts. Neurons are uniquely sensitive to oxygen loss. Unlike muscle or skin cells, brain cells store almost no energy. They rely on constant oxygen and glucose delivery to maintain electrical balance. When circulation falters, electrical signaling becomes unstable. Within seconds, normal brain rhythms change. Within a short time, consciousness fades. Loss of awareness is often one of the earliest outward signs that the system is failing. This loss is not intentional. It is mechanical. The brain can no longer sustain the chemical gradients required for awareness. Ion channels fail. Signals misfire. The organized patterns that support perception dissolve into noise and then silence. Breathing often follows a similar path. Breathing depends on brainstem function. When oxygen levels fall or the brainstem is damaged, respiratory rhythms weaken. Breaths become irregular, shallow, or stop entirely. Without breathing, oxygen depletion accelerates, further damaging the brain and heart. This feedback loop is central to dying. Circulation affects breathing. Breathing affects circulation. Failure in one amplifies failure in the other. The heart itself behaves differently than the brain. Cardiac muscle can continue contracting for a short time even with limited oxygen. This is why the heart may continue beating briefly after severe brain injury. But these contractions become weaker and less coordinated. Eventually, electrical instability leads to arrhythmias and effective pumping stops. At this point, circulation collapses completely. Other organs respond on different timelines. The liver, kidneys, and digestive system are more tolerant of short oxygen interruptions, but they cannot function without sustained blood flow. Filtration stops. Chemical balance drifts. Toxins accumulate. Internal conditions become hostile to cellular survival. Importantly, this shutdown is not dramatic. There is no sudden internal explosion, no single fatal switch. Instead, regulation slowly disappears. Temperature control fades. Blood pressure drops. Hormonal signaling becomes chaotic. The body is no longer maintaining itself. This stage reveals something critical about life. Survival is not about strength in isolation. It is about coordination. Even strong organs cannot function if communication fails. Another common misconception is that death always begins with pain or distress. In many cases, reduced brain oxygen leads to early loss of awareness. Sensory processing diminishes before widespread tissue damage occurs. While distress can occur in some circumstances, it is not an automatic or universal feature of dying. From a biological standpoint, dying is a loss of feedback. Sensors no longer report accurately. Controllers no longer respond effectively. Effectors no longer act in harmony. Once this loop is broken, recovery depends entirely on speed and intervention. If circulation and oxygen are restored quickly, coordination can sometimes return. If not, damage crosses thresholds that cannot be reversed. This is why timing is central in emergency medicine. Seconds matter. Minutes redefine outcomes. Beyond a certain point, restoring circulation does not restore life. It only restores motion in a system that has already lost its internal order. As circulation, breathing, and regulation fail together, the body moves from instability toward stillness. The organism ceases to exist as an integrated whole, even though many parts remain structurally intact for a time. Death at this stage is not destruction. It is disconnection. The brain plays a unique role in death because it is the center of awareness, memory, identity, and perception. When the body begins to fail, the brain is both the most sensitive system and the most revealing one. From a biological perspective, the brain is expensive to run. It consumes a large share of the body's oxygen and energy, yet it stores almost none of it. This makes the brain highly dependent on continuous circulation. Even brief interruptions begin to change how it functions. When oxygen delivery drops, the brain does not shut down evenly. The first changes occur in the cortex, the outer layers responsible for thinking, planning, and conscious awareness. Electrical activity becomes disorganized. Complex thought fades. Attention narrows. For many people, this is when confusion or a sense of detachment appears. As oxygen deprivation continues, the brain shifts into survival mode. Non-essential processing is reduced. Sensory input is filtered. Awareness becomes fragmented. This is not a deliberate response. It is a biochemical consequence of failing energy supply. At this stage, consciousness is unstable. Neurons rely on carefully balanced electrical charges to transmit signals. These charges are maintained by energy-dependent pumps embedded in cell membranes. When energy production falls, these pumps weaken. Ions drift across membranes without control. Signals lose precision. The result is altered perception. Time may feel distorted. Sounds may feel distant or unreal. Thoughts may lose continuity. These experiences are not evidence of the mind leaving the body. They are signs that the brain's internal coordination is breaking down. Deeper brain structures respond differently. The brainstem, which controls breathing, heart rhythm, and basic reflexes, is more resistant to oxygen loss than the cortex. This means basic life-sustaining functions may continue even after awareness has faded. A person may no longer be conscious, but still breathe irregularly or show reflexive responses. This separation between awareness and function is one reason death can be difficult to recognize without instruments. As oxygen deprivation progresses, even the brainstem begins to fail. Breathing becomes irregular or stops. reflexes disappear. At this point, the brain can no longer regulate the body. Inside neurons, a critical shift occurs. Calcium ions flood into cells as membrane control collapses. This triggers enzymes that damage proteins, membranes, and DNA. Once this process reaches a certain intensity, neurons cannot recover, even if oxygen is restored later. This is the biological boundary between injury and death. Interestingly, studies of dying brains have shown brief surges of synchronized electrical activity just before complete shutdown. These bursts are not signs of recovery. They are signs of final disorganization, as networks fire uncontrollably before falling silent. This phenomenon may help explain why some people report vivid experiences near death. Memory fragments, emotional imagery, and sensations may be released as inhibitory control fails. The brain is not creating meaning. It is losing structure. Importantly, this does not happen the same way for everyone. The timeline depends on temperature, health, cause of oxygen loss, and prior brain condition. A brain deprived of oxygen during cardiac arrest behaves differently from one affected by gradual respiratory failure. Cold environments can slow damage. Certain drugs can alter perception, but the direction is always the same. As coordination fails, awareness dissolves. The brain does not let go. It stops being able to hold itself together. This understanding challenges many cultural assumptions. Consciousness near death is not necessarily peaceful or painful by default. It is variable, mechanical, and dependent on biology rather than belief. From a scientific standpoint, the brain near death is not entering a new state. It is leaving an organized one. For most of human history, death was identified by simple signs. Breathing stopped. The heart no longer beat. The body became still. These observations worked when medicine had no way to intervene. But modern technology changed the meaning of those signs, forcing science to redefine what death actually is. Today, death is understood through function, not appearance. Cardiac death refers to the irreversible stopping of circulation. When the heart can no longer pump blood, oxygen delivery ends and the brain soon follows. Traditionally, this was enough to declare death. Brain death is different. Brain death is the irreversible loss of all brain function, including the brainstem. This means there is no consciousness, no awareness, no reflexes, and no ability to breathe independently. Even if machines keep the heart beating and lungs moving air, the person is considered dead. This distinction exists because the brain is not just another organ. The brain is the system that integrates all others. It coordinates breathing, circulation, temperature, reflexes, and awareness. Without it, the body cannot function as an organism. It becomes a collection of maintained parts rather than a living whole. Brain death is not coma. In a coma, brain activity is severely reduced but not absent. Some coordination remains. Reflexes may still function. Recovery, though uncertain, is possible. In brain death, recovery is not possible. Extensive testing is required to diagnose it. Doctors check for brainstem reflexes such as pupil response to light, eye movement, gag reflex, and spontaneous breathing. They may use imaging or electrical tests to confirm the absence of brain activity. Only when all criteria are met and the condition is irreversible is brain death declared. One reason this distinction is difficult for families to accept is that the body can appear alive. The skin is warm. The chest rises and falls with ventilation. The heart monitor shows a rhythm, but these signs are maintained artificially. The body is no longer regulating itself. Hormonal control is gone. Temperature regulation fails without support. Blood pressure collapses if machines are removed. Cardiac death, by contrast, is more visually final. When the heart stops and cannot be restarted, circulation ends, and the body quickly loses signs of life. Yet even here, medicine introduced complexity. Resuscitation blurred the boundary. A heart that stops is not necessarily a heart that cannot restart. Defibrillation, CPR, and advanced life support can restore circulation minutes after cardiac arrest. This is why death is not declared the moment the heart stops, but only after it is clear that restarting it is impossible. This brings both definitions together under one concept: irreversibility. Whether death is declared by cardiac criteria or brain criteria, the defining feature is that the loss cannot be undone. Temporary failure is not death. Permanent loss is. Different countries adopted brain death criteria at different times, influenced by medical capability, cultural values, and ethics. Some societies were slow to accept it, fearing mistakes or misuse. Over time, standardized testing reduced those fears. Brain death also made modern organ transplantation possible. Organs can only function if they receive oxygen. Brain-dead donors allow organs to be preserved, while the donor is legally and biologically dead. This creates ethical tension, but also saves lives. At its core, the distinction between brain death and cardiac death reflects a deeper truth. Life is not located in one organ. It exists in coordination. When that coordination cannot return, death has occurred, regardless of which system failed first. Understanding this distinction removes confusion and replaces it with clarity grounded in biology rather than intuition. One of the most common questions people ask about death is simple and persistent. Why can't it be reversed once it happens? At first glance, death can look like an extreme version of unconsciousness. The body is still, awareness is gone, movement has stopped. But biology draws a sharp line between states that can return and states that cannot. The difference lies in irreversibility. Reversibility is not about how dramatic something looks. It is about whether the underlying structure that makes life possible still exists. When circulation stops briefly, cells suffer, but their internal systems may still be intact. If oxygen and energy return in time, normal function can resume. This is why resuscitation works in some cases. The system was disrupted, but not destroyed. Death occurs when that disruption crosses a threshold. Inside living cells, order is actively maintained. Membranes hold electrical gradients. Proteins keep their shapes. DNA remains organized. All of this depends on constant energy input. Without energy, the forces that hold structure in place weaken. Once energy production stops for too long, cells lose control. Calcium floods into the cell. Enzymes activate uncontrollably. Membranes rupture. Structural proteins break down. At this stage, restoring oxygen does not restore function. The machinery required to respond is already damaged. This is the biological point of no return. The brain reaches this point faster than any other organ. Neurons are highly specialized and fragile. Once their internal structure collapses, they cannot divide or regenerate. Even if blood flow is restored later, the information encoded in neural networks is lost. This is why revival is not simply a matter of restarting the heart. The heart is a pump. The brain is a system of information. You can restart a pump. You cannot reconstruct lost information. Another reason death is irreversible is entropy. Living systems exist in a state of low entropy, high organization maintained against natural decay. Death removes the mechanisms that resist entropy. Disorder increases rapidly. Chemical gradients flatten. Structures drift apart. Revering this would require not just energy, but precise reassembly at a molecular level. Biology has no mechanism for this once coordination is lost. Importantly, death is not caused by one single failure. It is caused by cascading failures that reinforce one another. Loss of circulation damages the brain. Brain failure worsens breathing. Breathing failure accelerates cellular damage. Each step makes the next more severe. This cascade creates momentum. By the time death is declared, the system is no longer paused. It is dismantling itself. This also explains why there is no exact second when death happens. Irreversibility emerges over a window, not an instant. Medicine defines death when evidence shows that this window has closed. Cultural stories often imagine death as something that could be undone with the right intervention or technology. Biology does not support this idea. There is no switch to flip back on. There is only a system that has lost the conditions required to function. Understanding irreversibility does not make death less meaningful. It makes it more precise. Death is final not because of philosophy or belief, but because the physical structure that enables life no longer exists in a recoverable form. That is what separates death from every other state the body can enter. When the heart stops, the body does not enter death all at once. What follows is a sequence measured in seconds, minutes, and hours, shaped by oxygen loss, temperature, and the fragility of different tissues. In the first seconds, circulation collapses. Blood pressure drops to zero. Oxygen delivery to every organ stops. The brain reacts immediately. Electrical patterns become unstable as neurons lose the energy required to maintain precise signaling. Within 10 seconds, consciousness usually fades. This is not sleep. It is a rapid loss of the organized activity that supports awareness. Between 30 seconds and 1 minute, brain cells begin to experience severe stress. Energy reserves are exhausted. Ion pumps fail. Chemical gradients flatten. The cortex, responsible for thinking and perception, is affected first. By 2 to 3 minutes, widespread disruption spreads through the brain. Neurons are still structurally intact, but their internal balance is failing. At this stage, damage is progressing, but it may still be reversible if circulation is restored quickly and conditions are favorable. Around 4 to 6 minutes, the risk of permanent brain injury rises sharply. This window is critical. Not all brain regions fail equally. Deeper structures, including parts of the brainstem, can survive slightly longer than the cortex. This uneven vulnerability explains why reflexes may persist briefly even after awareness is gone. Beyond 6 to 10 minutes, irreversible damage becomes likely. Neurons begin to undergo structural breakdown. Calcium-triggered enzymes damage membranes and DNA. Once this process advances far enough, restoring oxygen no longer restores function. Meanwhile, other organs follow their own timelines. The heart muscle can tolerate oxygen deprivation longer than the brain. This is why cardiac tissue can sometimes resume beating after prolonged arrest under controlled conditions. But without brain coordination, these beats do not represent life. The lungs stop effective gas exchange immediately once circulation ends. Air may still move passively, but oxygen cannot reach tissues without blood flow. The liver and kidneys begin to fail within minutes as filtration and detoxification stop. Chemical balance drifts, waste accumulates. The muscles and skin survive longer. Their lower metabolic demands allow them to persist structurally even after the organism has died. This difference in survival time is why the body does not immediately collapse or decompose. Temperature also plays a role. Cold environments slow cellular damage by reducing metabolic demand. This is why hypothermia can extend resuscitation windows in rare cases. Heat accelerates damage, narrowing the margin for recovery. Another factor is cause. A sudden cardiac arrest deprives the brain of oxygen abruptly. A slow respiratory failure reduces oxygen more gradually. These different paths shape how neurons respond and how damage unfolds. Importantly, the timeline is not exact. It is a range, not a stopwatch. Medicine uses these ranges to guide decisions, but each case depends on health, age, temperature, and intervention speed. What matters most is this principle. The longer circulation is absent, the more coordination is lost. Death is not marked by a single minute passing. It is marked by the closing of the window in which the system could still recover. Once that window closes, restarting individual parts does not restore the organism. Motion may return, electrical signals may reappear, but the integrated system that defined life no longer exists. This timeline explains both the possibility and the limits of resuscitation. It also explains why death cannot be reversed by restarting one function alone. While the body's major systems fail at the visible level, a quieter and more decisive process unfolds inside individual cells. This microscopic breakdown is what ultimately makes death permanent. Living cells exist in a state of constant work. They are not stable by default. Order is maintained only through continuous energy use. Membranes separate inside from outside. Electrical charges are held in precise balance. Proteins keep specific shapes. DNA remains tightly organized. None of this happens automatically. Energy is the key. Cells rely on a steady supply of energy molecules to power pumps that control what enters and exits the cell. These pumps keep calcium, sodium, potassium, and other ions in carefully regulated positions. This balance allows cells to communicate, contract, repair damage, and stay alive. When circulation stops, energy production collapses. Without oxygen, mitochondria, the structures that generate most cellular energy, can no longer function efficiently. Energy levels fall rapidly. As energy declines, the pumps that maintain internal order weaken. This is where irreversible damage begins. One of the earliest and most destructive changes is calcium overload. Calcium ions rush into the cell when membrane control fails. Inside a living cell, calcium is tightly regulated because it activates powerful enzymes. When calcium floods the interior, those enzymes turn on uncontrollably. They begin breaking down proteins. They damage membranes. They fragment DNA. This is not a clean shutdown. It is internal disassembly. At the same time, water moves across damaged membranes, causing cells to swell. Some cells rupture. Others collapse inward as structural elements fail. Communication between neighboring cells breaks down and tissues lose integrity. Neurons are especially vulnerable. Brain cells are highly specialized and cannot divide to replace themselves. Once their internal architecture is disrupted, the information they carry, the patterns that encode memory, identity, and learned behavior, is lost permanently. This is why restoring blood flow after prolonged oxygen deprivation does not restore the person who was there before. The structure that supported thought and awareness no longer exists in a usable form. Different types of cell death occur during this process. Some cells undergo necrosis, a chaotic form of death caused by sudden injury and energy failure. Others activate apoptosis, a controlled self-destruction pathway that dismantles the cell in an orderly way. Apoptosis normally serves useful purposes in living bodies, but during widespread failure it contributes to tissue loss. Importantly, not all cells die at the same pace. Cells with lower energy demands, such as those in skin, bone, and connective tissue, can remain structurally intact long after neurons have been destroyed. This uneven survival reinforces the idea that death is not the disappearance of all life, but the loss of organized life. Another critical factor is oxidative damage. As cells lose control, unstable molecules called free radicals accumulate. These molecules damage membranes and genetic material further, accelerating breakdown. Without functioning repair systems, this damage compounds rapidly. Once these cellular processes advance far enough, recovery is no longer biologically possible. Even if oxygen returns, the internal machinery required to respond has been dismantled. At this level, death is no longer a system-level failure. It is a structural reality. The organism cannot be rebuilt from these fragments. Biology has no mechanism to reverse this degree of disintegration. What remains is matter, not a living system. Understanding death at the cellular level removes any remaining illusion of reversibility. It shows why death is final not by decision or definition, but by physical law. After death has occurred at the level of the organism, something counterintuitive remains true. Not all cells are dead. This fact often causes confusion, but it is central to understanding what death really means in biological terms. Life at the cellular level is not identical to life at the organism level. An organism is alive only when its parts work together as a coordinated system. Cells, however, are semi-independent units. Some can survive for a time without signals from the brain, circulation, or other organs. The key difference lies in energy demand. Cells that perform complex, continuous tasks require constant energy. Neurons must maintain precise electrical gradients. Heart muscle must contract rhythmically. These cells fail quickly when oxygen and energy disappear. Other cells are less demanding. Skin cells, bone cells, cartilage cells, and certain connective tissue cells consume far less energy. They do not rely on rapid electrical signaling. They are structurally robust. When oxygen stops, they slow down rather than collapse. This is why hair and nails can appear to grow after death, even though they do not actually grow. The surrounding skin dehydrates and retracts, making existing structures more visible. The cells themselves are not actively producing new material. It is also why tissue samples taken hours after death can still show living cells under a microscope. These cells are alive in a limited sense. They maintain membrane integrity. Some metabolic activity persists, but they are no longer part of a living organism. Another reason some cells survive longer is tolerance to waste accumulation. Brain cells are extremely sensitive to chemical imbalance. Even small changes in pH or ion concentration disrupt function. Many other cells can tolerate wide swings in internal chemistry without immediate destruction. Temperature plays a role as well. Lower temperatures slow chemical reactions. In cold environments, cellular processes degrade more slowly, extending survival time. This is why organs can be preserved for transplantation after death. Cooling reduces damage long enough for transfer to another body. Importantly, surviving cells do not indicate lingering life or awareness. There is no central coordination, no perception, no memory, no identity. The organism has ceased to exist, even though parts of it remain structurally intact. This distinction explains several medical practices. Organ donation depends on the fact that organs are composed of cells that can remain viable after death if oxygen and temperature are controlled. Skin grafts, corneal transplants, and bone grafts all rely on delayed cellular death. It also explains why revival is not possible once death has occurred. Even if individual cells remain alive, the The system that once organized them is gone. There is no mechanism to reconnect them into a functioning whole. Information pathways are broken. Control structures are destroyed. Cells alone do not make a person. A person exists only when cells communicate, coordinate, and integrate. Once that integration is lost beyond recovery, death has occurred, regardless of how many individual cells persist. This perspective helps clarify a common misunderstanding. Death is not the moment when the last cell dies. It is the moment when the last possibility of coordinated life disappears. Death is often described using familiar states, like falling asleep, like being unconscious, or like a deep coma. These comparisons feel intuitive, but biologically they are incorrect. Understanding why requires separating appearance from function. Sleep is an active biological state. The brain remains organized. Electrical patterns shift in predictable cycles. Breathing, circulation, temperature control, and repair processes continue. Even in the deepest stages of sleep, the brain is monitoring the environment. Sounds can wake a sleeper. Internal systems remain coordinated. Memory is processed. Hormones are regulated. Sleep depends on life. It does not resemble its absence. Unconsciousness is different, but still not death. Fainting, anesthesia, and certain injuries reduce awareness by disrupting specific neural pathways. However, the underlying structure of the brain remains intact. Energy production continues. Cells maintain gradients. Communication persists, even if perception is temporarily offline. Coma occupies a more severe position on this spectrum. In a coma, awareness is absent and responsiveness is minimal or non-existent. Yet many brain functions continue. Reflexes may be present. Sleep-wake cycles can occur. Metabolism remains regulated. Recovery, while uncertain, is sometimes possible. This possibility is the defining difference. Death is not defined by lack of awareness. It is defined by loss of recoverable structure. In sleep, coma, and unconsciousness, the brain's networks are disrupted or suppressed but not destroyed. The system still exists. Given time, support, or intervention, coordination can return. In death, coordination does not return. Another important distinction is information preservation. In sleep and unconscious states, memories, identity, and learned patterns remain stored in neural networks. Even after months in a coma, a person may retain aspects of their personality once consciousness returns. In death, those networks disintegrate. The physical patterns that encode memory and identity are damaged beyond reconstruction. Information is not paused, it is lost. Physiologically, this difference is visible. Electroencephalograms during sleep show organized rhythms. During anesthesia, activity is altered but structured. In coma, activity may be reduced or abnormal, but still present. In brain death, electrical activity ceases entirely. This is why brain death cannot be confused with unconsciousness. There is no state transition available, no pathway back to organization. Culturally, language blurs these distinctions. Phrases like eternal sleep soften the idea of death, but they also obscure reality. Sleep implies rest. Death involves irreversible breakdown. Understanding this difference matters not only scientifically, but ethically and medically. Decisions about life support, prognosis, and treatment depend on recognizing whether a system is suppressed or destroyed. Death is not deeper sleep. It is not deeper unconsciousness. It is a different category altogether. It is the absence of the conditions required for any state to return. One of the most persistent questions around coma and death is this: if someone can remain unresponsive for weeks or months and still wake up, why can the same not happen after death? The answer lies in structural preservation. In coma, the brain's communication pathways are disrupted, but the physical architecture that supports those pathways still exists. Neurons remain alive. Synapses remain intact. Chemical gradients are maintained at a basic level. Even when awareness is absent, the system that could support awareness is still present. This means recovery is uncertain, but possible. In death, that architecture is destroyed. The networks that allow signals to travel are physically damaged. Membranes rupture, proteins denature, DNA fragments. Once this happens, there is no framework left for consciousness to return to. This is why coma is a suspended state, while death is a collapsed one. A coma is like a city during a blackout. Death is like a city whose infrastructure has been dismantled. Power can return to the first. The second cannot function again without rebuilding from scratch, something biology cannot do. This distinction is subtle but crucial. It explains why medical hope exists in coma cases, but not after death has been declared. The difference is not duration or depth. It is structural survival versus structural loss. Popular stories often describe death as immediate, a sudden collapse, a single moment where everything ends. Biology tells a different story. What is commonly called instant death is almost never instant at the level that matters most. Even in sudden events, cardiac arrest, severe trauma, or catastrophic injury, the body moves through a short but real sequence of failure rather than an immediate end. The confusion comes from visibility. When movement stops suddenly, when speech ends, when a body becomes still, it looks final. But appearance does not equal completion. Inside the body, processes continue briefly, following the same physical rules as any other form of dying. In sudden cardiac arrest, for example, circulation stops abruptly. Awareness usually disappears within seconds because the brain can no longer maintain organized electrical activity. This creates the impression of immediate death. Yet at the cellular level, the brain has not stopped existing. Neurons are still intact. Chemical gradients have begun to fail, but have not yet collapsed completely. There is a short window where recovery is still biologically possible. This window explains why defibrillation and CPR can sometimes restore life after collapse. The heart may be restarted. Circulation may return. Coordination can be re-established if the underlying structures have not crossed the point of irreversible damage. Traumatic injuries follow a similar pattern. Even when injury is severe, the brain does not vanish instantly. Loss of blood pressure and oxygen disrupt function first. Structural damage follows later. The speed of this progression depends on the injury, but the principle remains the same. Failure precedes destruction. The idea of instant death persists because the brain's response is fast. Consciousness depends on precise coordination. When that coordination breaks, awareness fades quickly. To observers, this looks like an immediate end. But awareness ending is not the same as biological death being complete. Another source of confusion is the difference between sudden onset and instant completion. Death can begin suddenly, without finishing instantly. This distinction matters because it shapes how people think about survival, rescue, and responsibility. It also fuels myths that exaggerate the speed and simplicity of dying. In reality, biology rarely works that cleanly. Even in cases where recovery is impossible, the body still follows a sequence. Energy depletion, membrane failure, structural collapse. These processes unfold over minutes, not milliseconds. This does not mean suffering is prolonged or inevitable. In many sudden events, awareness is lost early. Sensory processing fades as the brain fails to sustain organized activity. But the absence of awareness does not mean the absence of ongoing biological change. Understanding this helps separate two ideas that are often merged incorrectly: the end of experience and the completion of death. The first can occur quickly. The second always takes time. The myth of instant death simplifies something that is biologically complex. It replaces process with moment. Science restores the sequence. Death does not arrive as a single strike. It unfolds as coordination fails, step by step, until recovery is no longer possible. Oxygen is not simply a fuel for the body. It is the condition that allows life's chemistry to remain ordered. Every living cell depends on oxygen to produce energy efficiently. When oxygen supply is reduced or cut off, the body does not fail randomly. It fails in patterns that reflect how tightly each system depends on continuous energy. This process is called hypoxia when oxygen levels fall, and ischemia when blood flow itself is blocked. Both lead toward the same outcome, but through slightly different paths. The brain is affected first because of its energy demands. Neurons require oxygen not only to stay alive, but to maintain precision. Their signaling depends on narrow chemical gradients and tightly controlled electrical states. Even small drops in oxygen disrupt this balance. As oxygen deprivation deepens, neurons cannot maintain order and communication breaks down. This is why awareness fades early in many forms of dying. It is not because the brain is shutting down deliberately. It is because oxygen-dependent processes can no longer sustain organized activity. Other organs tolerate oxygen loss differently. The heart muscle can continue contracting briefly under low oxygen conditions, though less effectively. This is why the heart may continue beating after severe respiratory failure or brain injury. The liver and kidneys endure short interruptions but fail as chemical waste accumulates. Skeletal muscle and skin cells survive longer still. These differences create the staggered shutdown observed during death. At the cellular level, oxygen deprivation disrupts mitochondrial function. Mitochondria use oxygen to drive efficient energy production. When oxygen is absent, cells switch to less efficient pathways that produce minimal energy and harmful byproducts. This shift cannot sustain life for long. Acid builds up. Energy reserves collapse. Repair mechanisms fail. As hypoxia continues, cells lose their ability to regulate ions, water, and internal structure. The damage becomes cumulative. Even if oxygen returns later, the machinery required to use it may already be compromised. Importantly, oxygen deprivation does not affect sensation and awareness equally in all cases. Rapid oxygen loss, such as in sudden cardiac arrest, often leads to quick loss of consciousness. Gradual oxygen reduction, as seen in respiratory illness or high-altitude exposure, can produce confusion, altered perception, or agitation before awareness fades. These differences shape subjective experience, but not outcome. In all cases, prolonged oxygen deprivation leads to irreversible damage. This understanding also explains why oxygen restoration has strict time limits. Medical interventions work only within the window before cellular structure collapses. Beyond that point, oxygen cannot reverse damage. It arrives too late to be used. Oxygen deprivation is therefore not just a trigger of death. It is one of the central mechanisms that transforms failure into finality. Life depends on controlled chemistry. Oxygen keeps that chemistry ordered. When oxygen disappears, order dissolves. When people survive close encounters with death, some report experiences that feel vivid, structured, and deeply real. These accounts are often grouped under the term near-death experiences, or NDEs. Science approaches these reports not as proof of something beyond the body, but as clues to what the brain does under extreme stress. Near-death experiences are reported across cultures, ages, and belief systems. While the details vary, many descriptions share common features. A sense of detachment from the body, altered perception of time, intense clarity or calm, visual imagery, or the feeling of moving through space. What matters scientifically is not whether these experiences feel real. They almost always do, but when and how they occur. Most NDEs are reported by people who were not fully dead, but very close to it. Their brains were severely stressed, deprived of oxygen, or undergoing sudden physiological change, yet still active enough to generate experience. This places NDEs in a narrow biological window. The brain is failing, but not yet destroyed. Under these conditions, normal regulation breaks down. Inhibitory systems that usually keep thoughts, memories, and emotions separated begin to weaken. As control fades, activity can spread unpredictably across brain networks. This can create unusual combinations of perception. Memories may surface without context. Visual imagery may become vivid and symbolic. Emotional responses may intensify or flatten. Importantly, these experiences do not require external input. The brain is capable of generating complex internal worlds even in the absence of sensory data. Dreams are a familiar example. Near-death states push this capacity into an extreme form. Studies using brain monitoring have shown that during severe oxygen deprivation, the brain can produce brief bursts of synchronized electrical activity. These bursts are not signs of recovery. They reflect instability, as networks fire together without normal control. Such activity may help explain why some NDEs feel organized rather than chaotic. The brain is not calmly processing information. It is briefly overactive as regulation fails. Another factor is time perception. Time perception depends on coordinated signaling across multiple brain regions. When this coordination breaks down, time can feel expanded, compressed, or absent. A few seconds of brain activity may be experienced subjectively as much longer. This helps explain why some people describe long narratives or detailed experiences during events that lasted only moments. Cultural expectations also shape interpretation. The raw experience may be similar across individuals, but the meaning assigned to it varies. A person raised with religious imagery may interpret the experience spiritually. Someone with a scientific background may describe it in neurological terms. The experience itself does not carry interpretation. The mind supplies it afterward. Crucially, near-death experiences occur before death is complete. They do not require the brain to be dead. They require it to be unstable. This distinction matters because it separates experience from speculation. Science does not deny that NDEs feel profound. It explains why they can occur without assuming consciousness exists outside the brain. Near-death experiences show us something important. The brain can generate intense meaning, even as it loses control. They are not evidence of death itself. They are evidence of a brain under extreme biological pressure. One of the most striking elements reported during near-death states is the way time behaves. People often describe time slowing down, stretching, looping, or losing all structure. Some report experiencing long sequences of memories or thoughts in what appears, from the outside, to be only a few seconds. This is not because time itself changes. It is because the brain's ability to measure time breaks down. Under normal conditions, time perception depends on coordination across multiple brain regions. Signals must arrive in the correct order. Rhythms must remain synchronized. Attention must be stable. When these systems function together, the brain produces a consistent sense of before, now, and after. Near death, this coordination begins to fail. Oxygen deprivation, chemical imbalance, and electrical instability disrupt the networks responsible for sequencing events. When the brain can no longer reliably track order, subjective time loses structure. Moments blur, gaps appear, duration becomes meaningless. This explains why a brief physiological event can feel expansive. Another key factor is memory release. Memory is not stored in one place. It is distributed across networks that are usually kept separate by inhibitory control. Under extreme stress, this control weakens. As it does, memory fragments can surface without normal filtering. This can create the sensation of a life review. Memories may appear rapidly, without context or chronology. Emotional associations may dominate over factual detail. The experience can feel comprehensive, even though it is composed of fragments rather than a complete record. Importantly, this is not the brain deliberately replaying a life. It is the brain losing its ability to limit access. Emotion plays a powerful role here. The brain regions that process emotion are closely linked to memory. Under stress, emotional signals can amplify memory recall. This amplification can make experiences feel significant, coherent, or meaningful, even when they are biologically disorganized. This combination, loss of time structure and increased memory access, creates a powerful subjective effect. A short burst of activity can feel timeless. A fragment can feel complete. From the outside, the brain may be seconds away from collapse. From the inside, experience may feel vast. This also explains why similar reports occur in other extreme states. People in accidents, high-speed falls, or severe stress sometimes report time slowing or memory flooding. These experiences do not require proximity to death. They require disruption of the systems that normally regulate perception and memory. Near-death states intensify this disruption. What is important scientifically is that these experiences do not require sustained brain function. They arise during instability, not stability. They do not represent a new mode of consciousness. They represent a loss of constraint. Once structure collapses further, these experiences stop. There is no extended narrative beyond that point. Memory formation requires organization, and when organization fails completely, experience ends. Time distortion and memory phenomena near death therefore tell us something precise. The brain can generate powerful subjective experiences as it loses control, but only briefly. They are the final expressions of a system still capable of activity, not signs of continued consciousness beyond death. Pain and awareness are often assumed to define dying. Many imagine death as a prolonged experience of suffering, where the body remains fully aware as systems fail. Biology paints a more nuanced picture. Pain is not a direct result of injury alone. It is a processed experience that requires intact pathways, energy, and coordination. Signals must travel from the body to the brain, be interpreted, and then integrated into awareness. When those pathways weaken, pain changes. As oxygen deprivation begins, the brain prioritizes survival over interpretation. Higher cortical processing fades first. This reduces the brain's ability to construct complex experiences, including sustained pain. In many forms of dying, awareness decreases before widespread tissue damage occurs. This does not mean pain never happens. It means pain is not guaranteed, uniform, or constant. The experience depends on timing, cause, and the state of the nervous system. There are two broad phases to consider. In the early phase, when circulation and oxygen are still partially intact, pain perception can occur. This is especially true in traumatic injuries or acute illness where nerves are stimulated while the brain remains functional. At this stage, pain signals can reach the brain, and awareness may still be present. As the process continues, sensory processing degrades. The brain's ability to localize sensation weakens. Signals become fragmented. Conscious attention narrows. Pain may become diffuse, muted, or replaced by confusion and detachment. This shift is not psychological coping, it is physiological failure. In the later phase, when oxygen deprivation deepens, awareness often fades completely. The cortex can no longer sustain the patterns required for conscious experience. At this point, pain perception is unlikely, not because injury has stopped, but because the brain can no longer interpret signals. Medical observations support this progression. In cardiac arrest, loss of consciousness typically occurs within seconds. In severe respiratory failure, awareness may persist longer, but it deteriorates as oxygen levels fall. In both cases, the brain's failure precedes the body's full breakdown. Another important factor is stress chemistry. During extreme physiological stress, the body releases substances that alter perception. Endogenous opioids and stress hormones can blunt pain and narrow focus. This response evolved to increase survival chances during injury, not to provide comfort, but it has the side effect of reducing perceived pain. This does not create peace. It creates narrowing. Attention collapses onto fewer sensations. Peripheral awareness fades. Complex emotional processing diminishes. The experience becomes simpler as the brain loses capacity. Importantly, pain is not the same as suffering. Suffering involves interpretation, memory, and anticipation. These processes depend on intact higher brain function. As those functions fail, suffering becomes less likely even if physical damage continues. This distinction matters in medicine. End-of-life care focuses on comfort because awareness can persist in some conditions. But biology itself often reduces awareness as death approaches. The nervous system does not amplify experience indefinitely. It destabilizes. This understanding challenges extreme narratives. Death is not universally painless, nor is it universally agonizing. It follows biological rules rather than stories. Pain requires coordination. Awareness requires energy. As both disappear, experience fades, not by choice but by mechanism. Once death has occurred at the level of coordination, the body enters a new phase. Life has ended, but matter remains. What follows is not random decay, but a series of predictable physical and chemical changes driven by gravity, temperature, and biology. The earliest changes are subtle. Muscles begin to relax as nerve signals stop. The jaw may loosen. Limbs may shift slightly due to loss of tone. This relaxation is not decay, it is the absence of control. At the same time, circulation has ceased. Blood is no longer being actively moved through vessels. Gravity takes over. Blood settles in the lowest parts of the body, creating darkened patches on the skin. This process is known as livor mortis. The pattern it creates depends on body position and can change if the body is moved early. Temperature regulation also stops. A living body maintains its internal temperature through metabolism and circulation. After death, heat production ends. The body slowly approaches the temperature of its surroundings. This cooling, called livor mortis, is gradual and influenced by environment, clothing, body size, and airflow. None of these changes indicate decay. They indicate stillness. Several hours later, another shift occurs. Muscles that initially relaxed begin to stiffen. This stiffness, known as rigor mortis, results from chemical changes inside muscle fibers. Energy molecules that normally allow muscles to relax are depleted. Without them, muscle fibers lock in place. Rigor mortis does not happen everywhere at once. It usually begins in smaller muscles, such as those of the face and jaw, and spreads downward. Over time, as muscle fibers themselves begin to break down, stiffness fades again. During this entire period, the body is not decomposing in the way many imagine. The structure is largely intact. Skin remains whole. Organs maintain shape. What has changed is regulation, not integrity. Internally, chemical balance continues to drift. Without circulation, oxygen is absent and waste products accumulate. pH levels shift. Enzymes that were once controlled begin to act without restraint. These changes prepare the conditions for the next phase, but they are not yet destruction. Importantly, the timeline of these changes is variable. Temperature, humidity, cause of death, and prior health all influence speed. A body in a cold environment changes more slowly than one in heat. A thin body cools faster than a larger one. These variations are why estimates of time since death are always ranges, not exact values. At this stage, the body still resembles itself. Identity has ended, but form remains. Understanding this phase helps separate reality from exaggerated imagery. The body does not immediately collapse or rot. It transitions. Structure gives way gradually as regulation fades. These early changes mark the boundary between life and transformation, setting the stage for processes that follow. After the early post-death changes, the body enters a phase driven not by regulation, but by chemistry and biology acting without control. This phase is commonly called decomposition, but it is better understood as a sequence of natural processes that follow the loss of life's organizing systems. Decomposition does not begin from the outside. It begins within. Even before death, the body contains trillions of microorganisms, especially in the digestive tract. While alive, the immune system and circulation keep these organisms in balance and confined. After death, that control disappears. Bacteria do not suddenly appear. They are already there. Without oxygen and immune defense, these microbes begin to spread beyond their usual boundaries. They digest surrounding tissues, releasing gases and chemical byproducts. This internal activity is one of the main drivers of decomposition. At the same time, the body's own enzymes begin a process called autolysis. Autolysis means self-digestion. Enzymes that once functioned within strict limits now act freely. Cells break down their own components. Membranes dissolve. Organelles disintegrate. This process is silent and microscopic, but it reshapes tissues from the inside. These two processes, bacterial activity and autolysis, work together. As tissues soften, bacteria move more easily. As bacteria produce gases, pressure builds within the body. This can cause swelling, particularly in the abdomen and face. Skin may stretch. Fluids may be displaced. Color changes occur as well. As blood components break down and chemical reactions continue, skin tones shift. Greenish or purplish hues may appear, especially near the abdomen where bacterial activity is strongest. These changes are chemical, not symbolic. Smell is another consequence. The odors associated with decomposition come from gases released during microbial digestion. They are not signs of something new entering the body, but of internal processes continuing without restraint. Importantly, decomposition is not uniform. Different tissues break down at different rates. Organs rich in enzymes, such as the pancreas and liver, degrade quickly. Dense tissues like cartilage and bone persist much longer. Skin can remain intact for extended periods depending on environment. Environmental factors strongly influence this phase. Heat accelerates chemical reactions and microbial growth. Cold slows them. Moisture supports bacterial activity, while dry conditions can slow decay or lead to natural preservation. Oxygen exposure also changes how tissues break down. This is why bodies decompose differently in water, soil, air, or sealed environments. Biology responds to context. Despite cultural associations, decomposition is not violent or chaotic. It follows physical rules. Matter transitions from organized biological structure to simpler chemical components. Energy disperses. Complexity decreases. Nothing in this phase involves awareness. By the time decomposition begins in earnest, the systems required for experience are long gone. What remains is matter undergoing transformation, not a living being undergoing sensation. Understanding decomposition removes mystery from something often treated with fear. It is not a punishment, a failure, or an abnormal event. It is the natural continuation of physical law once life's organization has ended. As decomposition progresses, the body becomes part of a much larger biological system. What appears to be an end at the human level is, at the ecological level, a transition. Matter does not disappear. It changes role. One of the most visible participants in this stage is insects. In natural environments, insects are often among the first external organisms to interact with a body. They are not attracted to death itself, but to chemical signals released during decomposition. These signals are precise and predictable, shaped by microbial activity and tissue breakdown. Flies, for example, detect specific compounds produced as cells break down. These compounds signal that a resource is available. Eggs are laid, larvae hatch, and feeding begins. This process may seem abrupt, but it follows a biological logic refined over millions of years. Insects do not accelerate decomposition randomly. They follow it. Larvae feed on soft tissues first, where enzymes and bacteria have already weakened structure. As these tissues are consumed, microbes gain access to new areas. The processes reinforce each other. Microbes continue their work throughout this stage. Bacteria that once lived quietly in the gut now spread freely. Environmental microbes join them. Together, they convert complex biological molecules into simpler compounds: carbon dioxide, nitrogen-based compounds, and organic acids. This is not destruction. It is recycling. The nutrients released during decomposition re-enter ecosystems. They enrich soil. They support plant growth. They feed other organisms. The atoms that once formed muscles, organs, and blood become part of new biological structures. This cycle operates without awareness or intention. From a biological perspective, death is not an endpoint. It is a change in how matter participates in living systems. The same elements that supported one organism support many others later. Different environments shape this process differently. In dry conditions, decomposition may slow, and insects may be less active. In aquatic environments, microbes and scavengers replace insects. In sealed or oxygen-poor environments, decay follows altered chemical pathways. These variations do not change the outcome. They change the root. Importantly, this stage of decomposition is entirely external to the person who once lived. Identity, memory, and experience ended long before this phase began. What remains is biological material responding to environmental conditions. This distinction matters. Cultural discomfort often comes from imagining continuity where none exists. Biology shows separation. The living system ended earlier. What follows serves the ecosystem, not the individual. Seen this way, death does not interrupt life on Earth. It sustains it. Atoms move from one form to another. Energy flows outward. Complexity decreases locally but increases elsewhere. This is not philosophy. It is ecology. The recycling of life through microbes and insects is one of the most fundamental processes on the planet. Without it, ecosystems would collapse under accumulated matter. Death makes continued life possible. Death is not unique to humans, and neither is the process that leads to it. Studying how other animals approach injury, dying, and death helps place human experience into a broader biological context. It also reveals which parts of dying are universal and which are shaped by cognition and social complexity. At a physiological level, the core mechanisms of death are shared across most animals. Cells depend on oxygen. Energy production fails without it. Organs shut down in predictable sequences. Mammals, birds, reptiles, and even many invertebrates follow similar biological rules. Neurons fail quickly. Muscles endure longer. Cellular breakdown follows loss of energy and regulation. Where animals differ most from humans is not in how they die, but in how much they can interpret what is happening. Many animals do not possess the level of self-awareness required to anticipate death as an abstract concept. They experience distress, pain, or disorientation when injured, but they do not usually conceptualize dying as a future state. This difference alters the psychological component of dying, not the biological one. For example, prey animals under extreme threat often enter states of immobility. This response is not resignation. It is a survival mechanism driven by the nervous system. Reduced movement can lower further injury or trigger a predator's loss of interest. If injury becomes fatal, this same shutdown reduces sensory processing as the brain fails. Social animals introduce another layer. Elephants, dolphins, some primates, and certain birds display behaviors around dead or dying members of their group. They may remain nearby, vocalize, touch the body, or show altered behavior afterward. These responses suggest recognition of loss, but not necessarily an understanding of death as humans conceive it. The biology remains the same. When oxygen delivery fails, awareness fades. When energy collapses, neurons lose coordination. No animal remains conscious indefinitely as death progresses. The nervous system destabilizes in every species. Animals also differ in how quickly death unfolds. Smaller animals with higher metabolic rates deplete energy faster. Their brains fail more rapidly under oxygen deprivation. Larger animals with slower metabolism may show longer shutdown timelines. These differences affect duration, not outcome. Importantly, animals do not experience the cultural layers humans attach to death. There is no fear of meaning, no narrative of afterlife, no anticipation of identity loss. This does not make animal death lesser or simpler. It makes it more direct. The experience is shaped almost entirely by physiology rather than interpretation. Studying animal death also clarifies something else. Life evolved alongside death. Biological systems are not designed to resist death indefinitely. They are designed to function, reproduce, and then give way. This pattern is visible across species, ecosystems, and evolutionary time. Understanding how other animals die removes the illusion that death is a uniquely human problem. It is a shared biological endpoint governed by the same physical laws. What differs is not the mechanism, but the story humans tell about it. Death is often described as something that interrupts life, as if life would continue indefinitely if nothing went wrong. From an evolutionary perspective, this idea does not hold. Death is not an external failure added onto living systems. It is a consequence of how life is structured. Living organisms are built to function under limits. Energy is finite. Materials wear down. Repair systems are effective but not perfect. Over time, small errors accumulate, structures weaken, efficiency declines. These changes are not accidental. They are the outcome of trade-offs that favor survival and reproduction over endless maintenance. Evolution does not select for permanence. It selects for success within a workable span of time. Most biological systems invest heavily in early and middle life. Growth, adaptation, and reproduction are prioritized. As long as these goals are met, there is little evolutionary pressure to preserve the system indefinitely. Long-term maintenance becomes increasingly costly, while its benefit to gene transmission diminishes. As damage accumulates, aging emerges. Aging is not a single process. It is the gradual imbalance between damage and repair. Cells lose precision. Tissues respond more slowly. Systems that once corrected errors efficiently begin to fall behind. Death marks the point where function can no longer be sustained. This pattern extends beyond individuals. In populations, constant renewal allows variation to persist. Older organisms eventually give way, making space for new combinations of traits. This turnover is essential for adaptation. Without it, populations would become rigid, less responsive to environmental change, and more vulnerable to collapse. At smaller scale, the same logic applies. Within living bodies, cells are routinely removed and replaced. Damaged cells self-terminate. Old components are dismantled. New ones take their place. This internal turnover prevents dysfunction and preserves overall integrity. The principle that operates inside the body also operates across generations. Death is therefore not separate from life's success. It is part of the system that allows life to continue. Importantly, this does not mean death was planned or intended. Evolution has no foresight. It does not design outcomes. It simply preserves what works in the moment. Systems that are efficient, adaptable, and reproducible persist, even if they carry long-term consequences. This explains why no complex organism achieves true biological immortality. Some species live longer. Some repair damage more effectively. But all eventually encounter the same constraints: limited energy, accumulating error, and the gradual loss of coordination. Physics and chemistry set boundaries that biology cannot escape. Life maintains order by constant effort. When that effort can no longer keep pace, order fades. Death is not a mistake layered onto life. It is what makes life, as we know it, possible within a finite world. Aging is often spoken about as if it were a single process, something that begins at a certain age and progresses steadily toward death. Biology shows something quieter and more complex. Aging begins early, moves unevenly, and remains mostly invisible until its effects accumulate. What matters is not when damage starts. Damage starts early in life. What matters is when repair stops being enough. Living systems are constantly correcting errors. DNA is repaired. Proteins are refolded or replaced. Cells are removed and renewed. These processes run continuously, even in youth. Aging does not begin when damage appears. It begins when repair falls behind. This shift happens gradually. Early in life, repair mechanisms operate faster than damage accumulates. Errors are corrected before they spread. Structure is preserved. Function remains stable. Over time, however, repair becomes less efficient. Not because it stops, but because it costs energy and complexity to maintain. Biology favors efficiency over perfection. Repair systems are themselves biological structures. They wear down. They depend on energy, signaling accuracy, and coordination. As these supports weaken, repair slows. Damage that once would have been corrected now persists. This is the quiet beginning of aging. Cells begin to accumulate small changes. DNA mutations escape correction. Proteins lose precise shape. Membranes become less flexible. None of these changes are dramatic alone. Together, they shift the balance. At the tissue level, renewal slows. Stem cells divide less reliably. Replacement cells are produced more slowly or with less accuracy. Tissues that depend on rapid turnover, such as skin, blood, and the lining of organs, show decline earlier. Other tissues appear stable for longer, masking underlying vulnerability. Aging is therefore uneven. Some systems fail early. Others compensate. Coordination hides damage until it cannot. This unevenness explains why aging does not feel like a smooth descent. Function can appear stable for years, then change rapidly. The system works until a threshold is crossed. That threshold is not fixed. It depends on genetics, environment, lifestyle, and random chance. Two individuals with similar biology may age at different rates because the balance between damage and repair diverges slowly over decades. What links aging to death is not time itself, but loss of resilience. A young system absorbs stress and recovers. An aged system responds more slowly and incompletely. Minor disruptions that once would have been corrected now trigger cascading failure. Death in this context is not a sudden arrival. It is the final outcome of accumulated imbalance. Importantly, aging is not programmed with an endpoint in mind. There is no biological clock counting down to death. There is only a system doing its best to maintain order under constraints until it no longer can. This perspective reframes aging. It is not a countdown. It is a negotiation between maintenance and decay. And when maintenance can no longer keep pace, the system does not fail all at once. It becomes fragile, vulnerable, eventually unable to recover. Death enters not as an event, but as a consequence. Recovery is one of the most underestimated abilities of a living system. Every day, the body absorbs stress, repairs damage, and returns to balance. Cuts heal. Infections resolve. Fatigue fades. For most of life, this capacity works quietly in the background, rarely noticed. What changes near the end of life is not the presence of damage. It is the loss of recovery. In younger systems, stress is followed by repair. The body returns close to its previous state. In aging systems, stress leaves a residue. Recovery becomes partial. Each event slightly alters the baseline. This shift happens slowly. An illness takes longer to resolve. An injury heals incompletely. Energy returns but not fully. These are not isolated failures. They are signs that the body's buffering capacity is shrinking. Recovery depends on coordination. Immune responses must activate and then shut down. Inflammation must resolve. Tissues must receive resources at the right time and in the right amount. When coordination weakens, recovery becomes inefficient or excessive. This is why aging bodies are more vulnerable to complications. An infection that would once have been cleared quickly may now overwhelm. Inflammation that once protected may linger and damage tissue. Stress responses that once restored balance may push the system further out of alignment. At the cellular level, recovery failure reflects declining repair accuracy. Cells still respond to injury, but the response is slower and less precise. Replacement cells may not integrate cleanly. Scar tissue may form where functional tissue once existed. Each imperfect repair subtly reduces overall function. Over time, these small changes interact. One weakened system stresses another. Reduced mobility affects circulation. Impaired circulation affects healing. Slower healing increases vulnerability to further stress. The system becomes tightly coupled, with little room for error. This is why death often follows seemingly minor events. A small infection, a mild fall, A brief interruption in oxygen. These are not powerful enough to kill a resilient system. They become fatal when recovery is no longer reliable. Importantly, this loss of recovery does not announce itself dramatically. There is no moment when the body declares it can no longer heal. The change is gradual, quiet, and often unnoticed until a threshold is crossed. When that happens, the system does not collapse immediately. It fails to return. This reframes how we understand final decline. Death is not always the result of overwhelming force. It is often the result of insufficient recovery. The body reaches a point where stress accumulates faster than repair can respond. At that point, balance is no longer restored. Coordination slips. Failure spreads. Life continues as long as recovery remains possible. Death arrives when recovery does not. Death is often explained by naming a cause. Heart attack, stroke, infection, respiratory failure. These labels feel definitive, but they describe triggers, not the final mechanism. What actually ends life is far more consistent than the variety of names suggests. Different causes lead to the same destination. Regardless of whether death begins with the heart, lungs, brain, or immune system, the body follows a limited set of final pathways. What matters is not where failure starts, but how failure spreads. This distinction is easy to miss. A heart attack is described as a cardiac event, yet the heart does not exist in isolation. When the heart fails, circulation stops, oxygen delivery collapses, the brain is deprived, cellular repair halts. The final pathway is not heart failure. It is systemic loss of coordination driven by oxygen deprivation. The same logic applies to stroke. A stroke begins as a localized disruption of blood flow in the brain, but death occurs only if that disruption spreads. Loss of consciousness, failure of breathing control, swelling, and widespread neural damage convert a focal event into a system-wide collapse. Infections follow a similar pattern. An infection does not kill by the presence of microbes alone. It kills when the body's response becomes disorganized. Inflammation spreads, blood pressure drops, organs receive inadequate oxygen, repair mechanisms fail. The trigger is biological, but the endpoint is systemic. This is why medical records list causes, while biology reveals pathways. The cause answers what started it. The pathway explains why it could not be stopped. There are only a few final pathways that end life. One is prolonged oxygen deprivation. Another is overwhelming loss of circulation. Another is failure of neural coordination. Often these occur together. The body does not collapse in parallel. It collapses in sequence. A failure in one system stresses others. Compensations activate. When compensation fails, the cascade accelerates. What began as a localized problem becomes a global one. This explains an important and often confusing reality. Many people do not die from the disease they were diagnosed with. They die from complications. An illness weakens recovery. A secondary stress overwhelms the system. The listed cause reflects the starting point, not the ending process. Understanding this reframes death away from labels and toward dynamics. Death is not a list of diagnoses. It is a loss of integration. When the body can no longer coordinate circulation, oxygen use, repair, and signaling, the specific trigger becomes less important. Different roads converge on the same endpoint. This perspective also clarifies prevention and treatment. Medicine works best when it interrupts pathways early, before coordination is lost. Once failure becomes systemic, options narrow rapidly. Timing matters because pathways close. Death, in biological terms, is not about what went wrong first. It is about what could no longer be held together. Death is often spoken about as if it has a clear, singular explanation. A certificate lists one primary cause. A story settles on one failure. But biologically, death almost never arrives through a single isolated event. What actually ends life is convergence. Multiple systems weaken together, interact and amplify one another's failures. By the time death occurs, no single system is acting alone. The body has entered a state where small problems no longer stay small. This is why the idea of one cause is misleading. A weakened heart reduces circulation. Reduced circulation lowers oxygen delivery. Low oxygen impairs the brain's ability to regulate breathing and blood pressure. Poor regulation worsens circulation further. Each step feeds the next. None of these failures on their own may be fatal at first. Together they are. This convergence explains why late-stage illness is unpredictable. The system becomes sensitive. Minor stresses, changes in position, slight infections, brief drops in blood pressure can trigger disproportionate effects. The body no longer has reserve. Reserve is the key concept here. A healthy system contains buffers. It absorbs disruption and restores balance. As reserve shrinks, recovery slows. As recovery slows, disruptions overlap. Overlapping disruptions interact instead of resolving independently. This interaction is what turns decline into collapse. Importantly, this does not mean the body is giving up. It means coordination has become too fragile to sustain. Medical intervention often reveals this clearly. Treating one failing system may stabilize it briefly, but other systems continue to decline. Support keeps parts functioning, but integration remains compromised. The organism persists mechanically, but resilience does not return. This is why intensive care can prolong life without restoring recovery. It also explains why prognosis becomes uncertain near the end. Predicting outcomes requires understanding not just which systems are failing, but how tightly they are coupled. Highly coupled systems fail together. Another consequence of convergence is loss of proportionality. Early in life, large problems are needed to cause major harm. Later, small problems can have large effects. This shift is not psychological, it is structural. When reserve is low, precision matters more than strength. Death emerges not because one system finally breaks, but because the system as a whole can no longer absorb disturbance. At that point, failure spreads faster than correction. This perspective reframes how we understand final events. The last visible cause is rarely the true explanation. It is simply the final stress added to an already unstable system. Death was approaching before that moment. The moment only revealed it. Biologically, death is not a singular strike. It is the outcome of accumulated vulnerability. Modern medicine often creates the impression that death is something to be defeated, postponed, or held at bay indefinitely. Machines support breathing. Drugs stabilize pressure. Monitors display steady numbers. Yet beneath these interventions, the same biological limits remain. Medicine does not replace life's coordination. It supports parts of it. At earlier stages of illness or injury, medical intervention works by restoring balance. Antibiotics reduce infection so the immune system can recover. Fluids restore circulation so organs can resume function. Surgery repairs damage so healing can proceed. Near the end of life, the role of medicine changes. Instead of restoring balance, it substitutes for failing functions. Ventilators move air when breathing control weakens. Medications regulate blood pressure when vascular coordination fails. Dialysis replaces filtration when kidneys stop working. These supports can extend time. They cannot restore integration. This distinction explains a critical transition point in care. As long as the body can use support to regain coordination, intervention moves the system back toward stability. When coordination cannot return, support only maintains fragments. The organism continues, but the ability to recover does not. This is why outcomes at the edge of life often feel uncertain or paradoxical. Numbers on monitors may look stable while overall condition worsens. Individual organs may appear supported while the system as a whole remains fragile. Medicine holds the line, but cannot rebuild what has been lost. Another important factor is timing. Early intervention interrupts pathways before convergence occurs. Late intervention enters a system where failures are already interacting. At that stage, treating one problem rarely resolves others. The cascade has momentum. This does not mean intervention is meaningless. Support can provide comfort. It can reduce distress. It can allow time for decisions, connection, or closure. But biologically, there is a boundary medicine does not cross. Machines do not generate coordination. They require it. This boundary is often misunderstood. When life support is withdrawn, death is not caused by the withdrawal itself. It occurs because the body no longer sustains function independently. The support was delaying an outcome already determined by biological limits. Understanding this reframes difficult decisions. Stopping intervention does not end life. It reveals whether life can continue. This perspective also clarifies why death remains part of medicine, not a failure of it. Medicine works within biological law. It can shift trajectories, slow decline, and reduce suffering. It cannot eliminate the fundamental constraints of living systems. At the edge of life, medicine becomes less about cure and more about alignment, matching intervention to what the body can still do. When that alignment is no longer possible, the system reaches its natural conclusion. Organ donation sits at a precise boundary between life and death. It depends on a distinction that is often misunderstood: death of the organism versus viability of parts. Understanding this boundary requires clarity about coordination, timing, and definition. In medicine, organs are not removed from living people. They are removed from bodies where life, as an integrated system, has already ended. This is possible because death is defined by irreversible loss of coordination, not by the immediate failure of every cell. When the brain permanently loses the ability to integrate breathing, circulation, and consciousness, the person has died, even if machines temporarily maintain blood flow. At this point, some organs may still be usable. Cells in the heart, liver, kidneys, and lungs can remain structurally intact for a limited time if oxygen and temperature are controlled. This does not mean the person is alive. It means that certain tissues have not yet crossed their own irreversible thresholds. This distinction is central. Life is not preserved by keeping blood moving alone. Life requires integrated control. Once that control is permanently lost, restoring circulation does not restore the person. Organ donation relies on this reality. After death is declared, most commonly by neurological criteria, medical support may continue briefly to preserve organ viability. During this time, the body is treated not as a living organism, but as a source of tissues that can still function elsewhere. This can feel counterintuitive. The heart may still beat. Skin may be warm. Machines may maintain breathing. Yet these signs reflect support, not life. The system no longer directs itself. It responds only to external force. Ethically, this boundary matters because it protects both donors and recipients. Donation occurs only after death is certain and irreversible. The goal is not to extend the donor's life, but to transfer functional tissue before cellular breakdown makes it unusable. Timing is critical because Organs follow their own biological clocks after death. Different organs tolerate interruption differently. Some require rapid transfer. Others allow longer preservation. All are constrained by the same principle. Cells can survive briefly without coordination, but not indefinitely. This process highlights something important about death. Death is not the disappearance of all biological activity at once. It is the loss of the system that organizes that activity. Organ donation does not blur this line. It depends on it. Understanding this helps resolve common confusion and discomfort. Donation does not occur before death. It occurs after life has ended, but before matter has fully transitioned. In this narrow window, one system has ended, and others can still begin. The brain is often described as an organ among others, but biologically it plays a different role. It is not just another component in the system. It is the integrator. It does not create life on its own, but without it, life cannot remain unified. As long as the brain can integrate signals, the body remains one system. Integration means more than awareness. It includes coordination of breathing, regulation of blood pressure, temperature control, reflexes, hormonal balance, and timing. These processes are distributed across many regions, but they are synchronized through neural networks. Death approaches when this synchronization fails permanently. Early in decline, the brain compensates. If one pathway weakens, others adjust. Reflexes become more active. Hormonal systems amplify signals. Automatic functions take priority over conscious ones. This redistribution keeps the system functional despite damage. As damage accumulates, compensation becomes inefficient. Signals arrive late, responses overshoot or undershoot. Feedback loops lose precision. Instead of stabilizing the system, corrections introduce new instability. At this stage, the brain is still active, but its control is degrading. This phase is critical. From the outside, the person may appear alive in a familiar way. Breathing continues. The heart beats. Reflexes respond. But internally, integration is fragmenting. Functions that once operated in harmony begin to drift out of sync. Eventually, a threshold is crossed. The brain can no longer maintain coherent control over vital systems. Breathing becomes irregular or stops. Blood pressure fluctuates uncontrollably. Temperature regulation fails. These changes are not isolated failures. They reflect the loss of centralized coordination. This is why brain death is considered death of the person. When the brain permanently loses the ability to integrate the body, no intervention can restore the organism as a unified system. Individual organs may still function briefly. Cells may remain alive, but the body no longer operates as one. Importantly, this loss is not gradual at the level that matters. There may be gradual decline leading up to it, but the transition from integrative control to permanent disintegration is decisive. Once neural networks responsible for coordination are structurally damaged beyond recovery, integration cannot return. This damage is not limited to consciousness-related regions. Deep brain structures that control breathing and cardiovascular regulation are especially important. When these regions fail, survival becomes impossible regardless of awareness. A person may be unconscious yet alive, but cannot be alive without these integrative centers functioning. This distinction explains many clinical realities. Machines can replace breathing. Drugs can stabilize pressure. Electrical packing can regulate heart rhythm. None of these restore integration. They substitute for isolated functions without recreating coordination. Integration requires internal communication, not external force. Once the brain can no longer provide this communication, the body becomes a collection of supported parts rather than a living organism. At that point, death has already occurred in biological terms, even if movement or circulation persists artificially. This chapter marks a transition in the narrative. Up to now, we have focused on processes that lead toward death. Here, we identify the boundary that defines it. Death is not the moment when everything stops. It is the moment when integration cannot return. People often ask for a precise answer to an imprecise event. When exactly does death happen? Is there a final second that separates life from non-life? Biology does not offer a single timestamp. This is not because death is mysterious. It is because death is distributed across systems that fail at different rates. Prediction becomes difficult not due to lack of knowledge, but because multiple variables interact in real time. In living bodies, stability comes from feedback. Heart rate adjusts to oxygen demand. Breathing adapts to activity and chemistry. Blood pressure responds to posture and stress. As long as feedback loops are intact, outcomes remain predictable. As these loops weaken, prediction becomes unstable. Near death, the system enters a state of high sensitivity. Small changes produce large effects. A minor drop in oxygen, a slight shift in electrolytes, or a brief interruption in circulation can tip the balance. The same stress that was survivable hours earlier becomes fatal later, not because the stress increased, but because the system's margin disappeared. This is why clinicians cannot give exact timelines. Two bodies with similar diagnoses may diverge rapidly. One stabilizes, the other collapses. The difference lies in hidden variables: cellular reserve, neural coordination, inflammatory state, prior damage, and timing of interventions. None of these variables change linearly. As integration weakens, failures interact rather than remain isolated. A fluctuation in breathing alters blood chemistry. Altered chemistry disrupts neural signaling. Disrupted signaling worsens breathing. These interactions accelerate unpredictably. At this stage, death does not approach smoothly. It approaches through instability. Importantly, prediction fails even with advanced monitoring. Machines can measure heart rhythm, oxygen saturation, blood pressure, and brain activity. They cannot measure integration directly. They infer it from fragments. By the time those fragments show irreversible collapse, the window for prediction has already closed. This explains a common experience in medicine. A patient may appear stable moments before death. Numbers look acceptable. Support is in place. Then coordination fails abruptly. The visible collapse reflects a hidden threshold being crossed, not a sudden new problem. Death, in this sense, is nonlinear. It does not arrive at a constant rate. It accelerates once compensatory mechanisms are exhausted. Prediction becomes unreliable precisely when it is most desired. This also explains why the concept of a last breath or final heartbeat is misleading. These are visible endpoints, not defining moments. The defining change occurs earlier when recovery becomes impossible. The visible signs follow. Biology does not provide a clock for death. It provides conditions. When conditions for integration no longer exist, death has already occurred in functional terms. The exact second is less important than the irreversible state that precedes it. Understanding this reframes uncertainty. Uncertainty near death is not ignorance. It is the result of complex systems reaching unstable limits. When people think about death, they often focus on the body stopping. What is more difficult and more unsettling is the question of identity. At what point does the person cease to exist, even if parts of the body still function? Biology approaches identity without metaphysics. Identity is not a single thing, it is a pattern. Memories, habits, emotional responses, decision-making styles, and recognition of self are distributed across networks in the brain. No single neuron holds a personality. Identity emerges from coordination across many regions, sustained moment by moment. As long as that coordination exists, identity persists. When the brain begins to fail, identity does not vanish instantly. It fragments. Early in neurological decline, subtle changes appear. Decision-making slows. Emotional responses flatten or become exaggerated. Memory retrieval becomes inconsistent. These changes are not psychological shifts. They reflect disruption in specific neural circuits. As failure progresses, the fragmentation deepens. Different aspects of identity disappear at different times. Long-term memories may remain while short-term memory collapses. Emotional recognition may persist while language fails. Familiar faces may be recognized without names. The person still exists, but not as a unified whole. This uneven loss reveals something important. Identity is not an indivisible essence. It is a networked process. Near death, when oxygen deprivation, metabolic collapse, and electrical instability spread through the brain, these networks lose coherence. Communication between regions breaks down. Integration fails. The brain can no longer maintain the patterns that produce a continuous sense of self. At this stage, awareness, if present at all, is fragmented and unstable. Eventually, a threshold is crossed. The networks that sustain identity are no longer structurally intact. Damage is no longer functional but physical. Once synaptic structures degrade and neurons lose internal organization, the information that defined the person cannot be reconstructed. This is why identity does not return after death. It is not hidden. It is not waiting. It is lost because the structure that encoded it no longer exists. This distinction matters in medical and ethical contexts. A body may still show movement, reflexes, or even hormonally driven responses. These do not indicate identity. They reflect residual activity in isolated circuits. Identity requires integration, not activity alone. This also explains why severe brain injury can alter personality while preserving life. Life continues as long as integration remains sufficient to sustain bodily coordination. Identity, however, depends on higher-order networks. These can degrade long before life ends, or disappear entirely while the body persists with support. Death, in this sense, is not only the end of biological function, it is the end of informational continuity. The person does not fade gradually into nothing. The system that made them who they were loses the ability to exist as a system. When integration ends, identity ends with it. Human societies surround death with meaning. Rituals, symbols, language, and stories attempt to frame what biology renders impersonal. This cultural layer does not change how death occurs, but it powerfully shapes how it is understood. Biology describes what happens. Culture explains what it means. These two domains often overlap, but they operate independently. From a biological standpoint, death is the irreversible loss of integration. Coordination fails. Recovery becomes impossible. Systems dissolve into parts. This definition remains stable across cultures, eras, and beliefs. Cultural interpretations vary widely. Some traditions emphasize transition. Others emphasize finality. Some focus on continuity of influence through memory or legacy. Others center on moral accounting or cosmic order. These frameworks help individuals and communities process loss, but they do not alter the underlying mechanism. This distinction becomes important when cultural expectations conflict with biological limits. Language often blurs categories. Phrases like "still with us," "watching over," or "living on" describe emotional persistence, not biological continuation. Memory survives in the minds of others. Influence persists through actions and consequences. The organism does not. Confusion arises when metaphor is treated as mechanism. Biology makes no claim about meaning. It makes claims about structure, energy, and coordination. Cultures, in contrast, assign narratives to fill the gap left by explanation. This is not deception. It is adaptation. Humans are meaning-seeking systems, and death confronts them with the limits of control and prediction. These narratives change over time. As medical knowledge expands, cultural interpretations shift. Brain death replaces older definitions. Machines challenge visual cues. New technologies force reevaluation of long-held assumptions. Culture responds by updating language and ritual, often slowly. Importantly, cultural meaning does not weaken biological clarity. A death can be meaningful without being mysterious, final without being empty. Recognizing biological finality does not strip death of significance. It relocates significance from mechanism to relationship. This separation allows both domains to function without conflict. Biology answers when recovery is impossible. Culture answers how loss is integrated into shared life. Problems arise only when one is asked to do the work of the other. When biology is expected to provide comfort, it cannot. When culture is expected to override biology, it fails. Understanding death fully requires acknowledging both layers without merging them. Biology defines the boundary. Culture responds to what lies beyond it in human terms. Neither replaces the other. They operate on different questions. After death, nothing mysterious is added, and nothing essential remains hidden. What remains can be understood by separating information, matter, and impact. These are often blended together, but biologically and socially, they follow different rules. First, information. The information that made a person who they were, memories, preferences, skills, patterns of thought, was encoded in neural structure. When that structure degrades beyond recovery, the information does not migrate elsewhere. It does not persist in the body. It ends with the system that sustained it. What can remain is recorded information. Photographs, writing, audio, video, and artifacts preserve representations, not continuation. They allow others to reconstruct fragments, but they do not extend the original system. A recording replays signals. It does not recreate the network that produced them. Second, matter. Atoms do not vanish at death. The same elements that formed tissues, organs, and cells remain subject to physical law. They change configuration. They enter other systems. Over time, they become part of soil, water, air, and living organisms elsewhere. This transition is exact, not symbolic. Carbon cycles. Nitrogen returns to ecosystems. Minerals redistribute. Nothing about this process retains identity. Matter persists without memory. Third, impact. Impact is often confused with survival, but it operates differently. Actions taken during life alter other systems, people, environments, institutions. These alterations can persist long after the individual ends. Influence propagates because systems interact, not because the original system remains active. Impact is causal, not conscious. A decision changes a trajectory. A relationship shapes behavior. A creation alters future possibilities. These effects continue without the person who initiated them. Understanding these distinctions removes ambiguity. Identity ends with neural integration. Matter continues through transformation. Impact persists through consequence. None of these contradict each other. They answer different questions. This framework also clarifies why people experience loss in layered ways. Grief often responds to identity, the absence of the person. Memory responds to information, What can be recalled or recorded? Meaning responds to impact, how life altered other lives. Confusion arises when these layers are treated as one. Biology does not negate memory or impact. It defines where identity ends. By separating these elements, death becomes less conceptually tangled. There is an end to the organism. There is continuity of matter. There is persistence of effect. Each follows its own logic. Nothing is left unresolved biologically. What remains unresolved belongs to human response, not mechanism. This distinction does not diminish significance. It clarifies it. Grief is often treated as something separate from biology, as if it exists only in emotion or culture. In reality, grief is a biological response to loss, shaped by neural wiring, memory systems, and social attachment. It is not a malfunction. It is a consequence of how brains form bonds. Attachment is not abstract. When humans form relationships, the brain physically changes. Neural pathways strengthen through repeated interaction. Expectations form. Predictive models develop. The presence of another person becomes part of the brain's baseline assumptions about the world. Loss disrupts those assumptions. When a person dies, the brain does not immediately update its internal model. It continues to predict interaction that will never occur. This mismatch between expectation and reality produces the core experience of grief. Grief at its foundation is prediction error. The brain expects signals, voices, responses, routines, and does not receive them. Each absence reinforces the discrepancy. Over time, the brain must revise its model of the world to exclude the person who is gone. This revision takes time because the brain resists rapid restructuring of deeply embedded patterns. Memory plays a central role. Memories associated with the lost person are distributed across sensory, emotional, and contextual networks. These memories activate automatically when familiar cues appear. Places, times of day, or habitual actions can trigger recall before conscious control intervenes. This is why grief often arrives in waves. The brain is not choosing to revisit loss. It is encountering cues that were once predictive and are now unresolved. Each activation requires reprocessing. Physiologically, grief affects the entire body. Stress hormones rise, sleep patterns disrupt, appetite changes, immune function may weaken temporarily. These effects are not signs of illness. They reflect the cost of prolonged neural recalibration. Importantly, grief does not follow a fixed sequence. There is no universal order of stages. The brain does not move smoothly from denial to acceptance. Instead, it oscillates. Some days the updated model holds. Other days older patterns resurface. This fluctuation is normal. Over time, integration occurs. The brain gradually learns that predictions involving the lost person will not be fulfilled. Memories remain, but they are no longer paired with expectation of interaction. The discrepancy decreases. Emotional intensity lessens, not because memory fades, but because prediction stabilizes. This does not mean the bond disappears. The neural representation changes form. It shifts from active expectation to stored reference. The person becomes part of the brain's history rather than its present model of the world. Grief ends not when love ends, but when prediction adapts. Understanding grief biologically does not reduce its meaning. It removes unnecessary confusion and guilt. There is nothing wrong with prolonged grief, fluctuating grief, or quiet grief. Each reflects the pace at which a complex system updates itself. Grief is not weakness. It is evidence of deep neural integration. The same mechanisms that make connection possible make loss powerful. Biology does not separate them. One of the most confusing aspects of loss is that even after death is fully understood, accepted, and explained, the mind continues to behave as if the person still exists. This is not denial, imagination, or emotional weakness. It is a normal consequence of how cognition is structured. The brain does not update reality all at once. It updates it locally. Different cognitive systems operate semi-independently. Some register facts quickly, others adapt slowly. When someone dies, factual understanding may arrive early, while behavioral and emotional systems lag behind. This is why people may intellectually know someone is gone, yet still reach for their phone, set aside food, or expect a response. These actions are not conscious choices. They are automated outputs of systems trained over time. Habit systems are especially slow to change. Habits form through repetition and reinforcement. They are stored in neural circuits that prioritize efficiency over accuracy. Once established, they do not require conscious attention to execute. When a person disappears, the habit circuits do not receive an immediate signal to stop. They continue until new patterns replace them. This is also why sensory memory can feel vivid after loss. A familiar voice may seem audible in quiet moments. A face may appear briefly in a crowd. These are not hallucinations. They are pattern completion events, where the brain fills in expected input when cues partially match stored templates. The brain evolved to predict, not to wait. Prediction allows faster response in a complex world. After loss, prediction becomes inaccurate, but it does not turn off instantly. The brain must learn through repeated mismatch that certain predictions will no longer be fulfilled. This learning is gradual. Another layer involves social identity. Humans define themselves partly through relationships. Roles like partner, sibling, parent, or friend are not labels alone. They are active frameworks that guide behavior and decision-making. When a person dies, the role associated with them becomes undefined. The brain must reconstruct identity without that relational anchor. This reconstruction takes time because identity is not stored in one place. It is distributed across memory, emotion, and future planning. Until these systems realign, the mind may feel disoriented, even when life continues normally. Importantly, these responses do not indicate that the person is still present in any biological sense. They indicate that the brain is adjusting to a changed environment using systems designed for stability, not rapid loss. Over time, prediction updates. Habits weaken. Sensory triggers lose intensity. Roles reconfigure. The mind stops preparing for interaction that will never occur. What remains is memory without expectation. This transition is not erasure. The person remains represented in memory networks, but no longer occupies active predictive space. The brain learns the difference between remembering and anticipating. Understanding this process removes unnecessary fear and confusion. Nothing is wrong when the mind responds to absence as if it were presence. It is doing exactly what it evolved to do, maintain continuity until evidence forces revision. Eventually, revision occurs, not because memory fades, but because prediction adapts. Fear of death is often treated as a philosophical problem, but at its core, it is a biological response generated by prediction systems in the brain. The brain did not evolve to understand death. It evolved to avoid threats, maintain continuity, and project itself forward in time. Death disrupts all three. The human brain constantly predicts the near future. It simulates outcomes, plans actions, and maintains a sense of continuity. I will still be here. This assumption operates quietly in the background of daily life. It is rarely examined, but it is deeply embedded. Fear arises when prediction fails. Death represents a condition the brain cannot simulate properly. There is no experience of non-experience. There is no internal model for absence of self. When the brain attempts to predict death, it encounters a blank space. This prediction gap produces anxiety, not because death is understood as painful or dark, but because it is unrepresentable. The brain interprets this gap as danger. This response is automatic. It does not depend on belief, education, or culture. Even individuals who intellectually accept death as natural may still feel fear at the thought of it. This is not contradiction. It is layered processing. Cognitive understanding and predictive emotion operate separately. Another source of fear comes from loss of control. The brain is built to influence outcomes. It expects actions to have effects. Death represents a state where action no longer matters. This violates one of the brain's strongest assumptions, that effort changes the future. When that assumption collapses, discomfort follows. Importantly, fear of death is not fear of a specific sensation. Most people do not fear pain endlessly or darkness forever. They fear the collapse of narrative continuity, the end of plans, roles, and unfinished trajectories. The brain reacts to this as it would to any major disruption of expectation. This also explains why fear of death fluctuates. At times when life feels stable and predictable, fear recedes. When uncertainty rises, illness, loss, aging, the brain's predictive models become fragile. Thoughts of death surface more easily because the sense of continuity is already under strain. Cultural frameworks interact with this biology. Beliefs about afterlife, legacy, or meaning can reduce fear by offering alternative predictive models. They give the brain something to simulate beyond death. This does not change biology, but it changes prediction. However, even without cultural narratives, fear can soften over time. Repeated exposure to the idea of death, when not paired with immediate threat, allows the brain to reduce its alarm response. The unknown remains unknown, but it becomes less disruptive. Prediction systems learn that thinking about death does not require urgent action. This is not acceptance in a philosophical sense. It is habituation. Understanding fear of death biologically reframes it. Fear does not indicate lack of courage. It indicates a brain doing what it evolved to do: protect continuity. Death challenges continuity at the deepest level. The brain responds accordingly. Acceptance of death is often described as a moral or emotional achievement, as if it were something a person decides to reach. Biology tells a different story. Acceptance is not a single decision. It is a neural adaptation that emerges when prediction systems stabilize. The brain does not accept facts because they are true. It accepts them when they stop generating unresolved prediction errors. Earlier chapters showed how fear of death arises from the brain's inability to model non-existence. Acceptance begins when the brain stops trying to model it actively. This does not mean understanding death fully. It means reducing the need to simulate it. Acceptance is therefore a shift in attention, not belief. When a system repeatedly encounters a concept that does not require action, its alarm response weakens. The brain learns that the topic does not demand immediate correction or control. Neural resources are reallocated elsewhere. This is why acceptance often feels quiet rather than dramatic. There is no sudden insight, no emotional breakthrough, no final answer. Instead, thoughts about death lose urgency. They no longer dominate planning or emotional response. The brain treats death as a boundary condition rather than an active threat. This adaptation depends on stability. When life feels predictable, socially, physically, emotionally, the brain's need to constantly evaluate death decreases. When stability erodes, death re-enters awareness. Acceptance is therefore not permanent. It fluctuates with context. Importantly, acceptance does not require positive framing. One does not need to see death as beautiful, meaningful, or comforting. The brain only needs to recognize that continued rumination offers no new actionable information. At that point, attention shifts naturally. This is why acceptance often emerges indirectly. People who focus on present tasks, relationships, and routines may find that thoughts of death fade without deliberate effort. The brain prioritizes immediate predictive demands over abstract endpoints. Acceptance also does not erase fear entirely. Low-level uncertainty remains because the brain never gains a complete model of death. What changes is scale. Fear becomes background noise rather than foreground signal. This explains why acceptance can coexist with moments of anxiety. Aging, illness, or loss may temporarily increase focus on death. Once the system restabilizes, attention recedes again. Acceptance is not a state achieved once. It is a pattern that reasserts itself when conditions allow. Understanding acceptance biologically removes pressure. There is no correct way to accept death. There is no timeline. There is no failure if fear returns. The brain adapts at its own pace, guided by prediction, stability, and relevance. Acceptance is not surrender to death. It is the brain reallocating energy toward life while it is available. That reallocation happens quietly, without instruction, when the system no longer needs to struggle with what it cannot change. At the end of this exploration, nothing new needs to be added to death itself. Biology has already drawn its boundaries clearly. What remains is understanding how those boundaries reflect back on life. Death does not introduce meaning. It reveals constraints. Life exists within limits of energy, repair, coordination, and time. These limits are not defects. They are the conditions that make complexity possible. Without limits, systems cannot organize. Without organization, there is no experience. Throughout this journey, one idea has remained constant. Life continues as long as integration holds. Cells coordinate, organs synchronize, the brain integrates. When integration weakens, life becomes fragile. When integration ends, life ends. Nothing about this process is dramatic or symbolic. It follows physical law. Understanding this removes confusion. Death is not a single moment. It is not a mystery layered on top of biology. It is the natural outcome of systems reaching the limits of repair and coordination. Fear fades when clarity replaces uncertainty. Acceptance emerges not because death becomes comforting, but because it becomes understandable. When death becomes clear, attention naturally returns to the present, to life while it is functioning, to connection while it is possible, to awareness while it exists. This topic is now complete. If you are still awake, allow your thoughts to settle. If rest is near, let it arrive naturally. If other videos or playlists are appearing on your screen right now, you're welcome to continue exploring them as well. Each one examines a different idea slowly and carefully, without urgency, so you can keep learning at your own pace. And if this exploration helped you understand something that once felt distant or unclear, you can support the channel by liking the video, subscribing for future deep explorations, and sharing your thoughts in the comments. One curious soul at a time.